All right, so today we're going to dive into something really, really interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how studying the human mind is actually changing the way we think about ethics. We're diving into moral psychology, so that's kind of where philosophy meets like the hard science of how we
Ooh.
actually work, right?
Right. So for a really long time, philosophers have been, building these systems of thought about right and wrong,
Right.
and often just kind of making assumptions about human nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's really cool now is that we have these empirical tools to actually test these assumptions.
Yeah.
Like it's like we can actually look under the hood of the moral machine now.
I like that analogy. Okay, so let's say you are a philosopher and you've spent years and years building a moral framework. Why should you care what a psychologist in a lab coat is finding, right?
Yeah.
What's the core appeal here for someone in philosophy?
Well, you know, you can think of it like this. An ethical theory, no matter how elegant it is or how nice it sounds, it needs to be livable, right?
Right.
It needs to apply to creatures like us
Yeah.
with the actual psychologies that we have.
Yeah.
Moral psychology offers us this reality check.
Okay.
If an ethical theory says that people are going to make these perfectly rational decisions all the time,
Right.
but then psychology is showing us that we have all of these biases and make mistakes,
Yeah.
then that theory might have problems connecting up to the real world.
Okay, so it's making sure the software is playing well with the hardware.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Grounding philosophical ideas in the reality of human experience.
I like that. So what are the central questions that we're going to be grappling with in this dive?
So I think there are really two main questions.
Okay.
The first is, what psychological claims are baked into different ethical theories, even if they're not stated explicitly.
Okay.
And the second is, how well do these claims hold up against the evidence that we're gathering about how people actually think and behave
Yeah.
in moral situations?
Okay, so it's like holding up a mirror to these philosophical ideas and being like, okay, do they actually hold water based on how people actually are?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It seems like a very interesting exercise in accountability almost
Hopefully.
for these big, 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 philosophical frameworks.
It is.
Yeah.
And what makes it so cool is that there are all of these different tools that we can use to study this stuff.
Oh, okay.
We can use classic psychology experiments.
Right.
We can look at, cross-cultural anthropology, and we can even look at the latest findings in neuroscience.
Wow.
It's really, really interdisciplinary.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't just about like, running an experiment and then being like, oh, well, that philosophical theory is wrong, right?
Right.
Like, what are some of the like inherent challenges in this kind of cross-disciplinary work?
You're totally right. It's not that straightforward.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges is just figuring out which philosophical claims are even testable.
Okay.
Sometimes philosophers have this concept that is meant to be an ideal.
Oh, okay.
It's something we should aim for.
Yeah.
It's not something that describes how we are.
Got it.
And also, philosophers aren't always explicit about what psychological assumptions they're making.
Right. Yeah.
So are they talking about how moral character actually manifests in people?
Right.
Or are they talking about how it ideally should manifest?
Okay.
Figuring out what you're supposed to be aiming at with the empirical research is a real challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so how do we actually evaluate a philosophical idea using moral psychology?
Yeah.
What's the roadmap there?
Okay, so there are a few key stages to this.
Okay.
First, you've got to carefully identify the claims within the philosophical theory that are accessible through empirical research.
Oh, okay.
Then you've got to, dive into the research, all the
Yeah.
studies from psychology and related fields that might be relevant to those claims.
Yeah.
Then you have to assess how good that research is.
Right.
How rigorous it is.
Yeah.
Then finally, you assess whether the philosophical view is supported or not.
Right.
We say that the philosophical view is empirically adequate
Okay.
if it's supported by the evidence.
Got it.
Now, if the evidence lines up with the view, we call that a vindicatory outcome.
Okay.
And if it suggests that the view needs to be rethought,
Yeah.
that's revisionary.
Right.
And often, choosing between different theories isn't about figuring out which one is perfect.
Yeah.
It's about which one has the strongest empirical support.
Right. So this isn't just a one-way street, right?
Yeah.
Where psychology is kind of like telling philosophy what to do.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Philosophy can also like,
Sure.
kind of like shape the questions that we ask in these empirical studies, right?
Absolutely.
The way that we even think about the questions that we ask in the human sciences
Right.
can be influenced by underlying philosophical
Yeah,
assumptions.
yeah. Okay.
So what we want is this nice dialogue. We want these disciplines to talk to each other,
Yeah.
to inform each other,
Yeah.
and to make each other better.
Right. Right. Okay. So I think we need some concrete examples here.
Yeah.
Uh, where has this philosophical and psychological interplay been like the most fruitful, or maybe like the most controversial?
Right. So I think we see this dynamic playing out in areas like, our reliance on thought experiments,
Yeah.
the way that we understand moral responsibility
Oh.
in light of determinism, the
Mhm.
very idea of moral character, the classic question of egoism versus altruism,
Right. Yeah.
and also in trying to understand why we see so much moral disagreement in the world.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so let's start with those classic philosophical tools, thought experiments. I feel like philosophers love them, but what does psychology have to say about how they actually work?
Right. Thought experiments are, sometimes called intuition pumps.
Okay. Yeah.
They're hypothetical scenarios that philosophers cook up
Right.
to try to get this immediate philosophical response out of you.
Okay.
It's gut feeling.
Yeah.
And that gut feeling then serves as data
Right.
for evaluating different ethical theories. The
Yeah.
idea is that if a thought experiment consistently pulls out of people a certain reaction,
Right.
then a good ethical theory should be able to explain that reaction.
Okay. Okay.
It should accommodate that intuition.
But who are we asking these questions to, right?
Yeah.
Does it matter if it's like a seasoned philosopher versus, someone just walking down the street?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate about this within philosophy itself.
Yeah.
Some people say that it's the intuitions of ordinary people
Right,
that
right.
really matter here, because, morality is about guiding everyday life.
Right.
Other people say that you need philosophers.
Okay.
People who are trained to see these subtle distinctions
Right.
and to avoid common mistakes and biases.
Okay.
But the real difficulty here is that if you ask people who aren't trained in philosophy,
Yeah.
they might not understand all of the complexities.
Right. Right.
But then if you ask philosophers,
yeah.
their responses might be shaped by their existing theoretical commitments.
Right. So you kind of lose a neutral starting point.
You do. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the problem.
So psychology steps in here and says, "Hey, where are these intuitive responses actually coming from?"
Right.
Right.
Or
Like,
exactly.
what's influencing them?
That's right. So research has shown that, our responses to these thought experiments
Yeah.
aren't always as straightforward or as purely moral as we might think.
Okay.
Things like how the scenario is described.
Yeah.
The background of the person who's answering the question,
Right.
and even like totally irrelevant environmental factors
Okay.
can really affect our judgments in big ways.
Really?
Yeah. And the worry here is that we might be building these ethical theories
Yeah.
on responses that are being driven by ethically irrelevant factors.
Right.
It's not really the ethics that's driving it.
Yeah.
It's these other things.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the worry.
So you have a prime example of that, right?
I do.
Where our moral choices are being kind of like nudged in certain directions by
Yes.
how things are being framed.
Exactly. So think about that classic Asian disease study by Tversky and Kahneman.
Yeah. Yeah.
They gave people this hypothetical scenario about a disease outbreak
Right.
and two possible interventions.
Okay.
When they framed the options in terms of lives saved,
Yeah.
people preferred this sure option.
Yeah.
But then when they framed the exact same outcomes
Yeah.
in terms of lives lost,
Yeah.
people preferred the riskier option.
Really?
So it's like the underlying reality
Yeah.
is the same,
Yeah.
but just changing how it was presented
Yeah.
flipped people's choices.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this shows that like our
Yeah.
gut feelings, like you were saying, they're not necessarily tapping into
Yeah.
some like deep moral truth.
Yeah.
It's more about how the information is being like packaged.
It is. Yeah. It shows
Yeah.
how sensitive our judgments can be to just superficial framing.
Yeah. And it's not just about framing, right?
Yeah.
There's also like these order effects
Right. So there's research that shows
Mm.
that the order that you present these thought experiments
Right.
can actually affect people's responses.
Wow.
And they've even shown this with philosophers.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can actually change the moral intuitions that you pull out of people just by changing the order in which you present the dilemmas.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so even the experts aren't immune
They're not. Yes.
to these kinds of biases.
That's right.
Yeah. Are there other kind of like surprising factors that
Yeah.
can influence like, our moral compass in these scenarios?
Yeah, so for example, there are studies that show that things like socioeconomic status
Okay.
can affect whether people think something is a moral issue or not.
Really?
Yeah. And even things like, being in a clean-smelling environment.
What?
Yeah, yeah.
That's wild.
So a clean-smelling environment versus a dirty one,
Yeah.
or experiencing like a flash of disgust
Really?
can actually shift people's moral judgments.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That our surroundings can actually have such an impact on our,
Yeah.
our abstract moral reasoning, I guess.
It does. It's wild, but the research suggests that all of these subtle environmental cues and these fleeting emotional states
Right.
can really have a big impact on our moral intuitions in these artificial scenarios.
Okay, so what's the upshot here for philosophers?
Right.
Are they just abandoning thought experiments altogether?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think thought experiments can still be really valuable for exploring these concepts
Yeah.
and figuring out, what our initial responses are.
Right.
I think the psychological research suggests that we should be much more cautious
Right.
about taking those initial intuitions
Right.
as the final word on the matter.
Yeah.
I think the alternative is to actually use psychology
Okay.
to study
Yeah.
these responses in more detail,
Yeah.
to try to understand what's driving them
Right.
and to try to figure out, which of them are the more robust ones.
Yeah.
Which are the ones that reflect these deeper moral convictions.
Yeah.
Which of them are just kind of noise
Right.
that's being driven by irrelevant factors.
Okay. So it's about being like more scientifically informed
Yeah.
about how we're using and interpreting these results.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay. Let's turn to another big one now.
Yeah.
Moral responsibility.
Right.
How has psychology kind of engaged with this issue?
Yeah.
Especially in the light of free will and determinism.
Okay. So this gets to this really old philosophical question.
Right.
If everything is predetermined,
Yeah.
can we really be held responsible for our actions?
Yeah. Yeah.
And psychology has offered this interesting perspective
Okay.
on something that we call folk morality, which is our everyday understanding of morality.
Oh, right. Right.
The way that we think about it intuitively.
Yeah.
And Joshua Noby's work has been super influential here
Yeah.
in exploring how we think about intentionality and blame.
Right.
And this has implications for the philosophical debate between incompatibilists who say that if our actions are determined, we can't be responsible, and compatibilists who say that we can.
Right. Right.
So incompatibilists often say that our intuitive understanding of things lines up with their view.
Right.
They say that, if our actions are determined,
Yeah.
then we can't really be responsible for them.
Okay. What about compatibilists?
Compatibilists say that, the way that we hold each other responsible in everyday life
Yeah.
and the way that we express praise and
Yeah.
blame,
Yeah.
all of that stuff doesn't actually depend on us believing in this kind of libertarian free will
Right.
where our actions are totally undetermined.
Right. Right.
And so they say that, even if we accepted determinism,
Yeah.
these reactive attitudes
Yeah.
would still be around.
Okay.
They're fundamental to our social interactions.
Right.
And they wouldn't just disappear.
Okay.
Some compatibilists even see the incompatibilist worry as this kind of philosophical overthinking.
Right.
It's not really how we actually operate in the world.
Yeah.
That's how they see it.
Okay, so for a long time, this was kind of like debated on purely like philosophical grounds, I guess.
Right.
But has empirical research actually kind of
Yeah.
shed some light on what people think about responsibility in this deterministic world?
Yeah, it has. And the findings have been really interesting.
Okay.
For example, there was this study by Woolfolk, Doris, and Darley,
Okay.
where they looked at the idea of identification.
Okay.
They found that even when you tell people that an agent didn't have any alternative but to act in a certain way,
Yeah.
they're still more likely to say that the agent is responsible
Oh, wow.
if it seems like the agent endorsed the action.
Okay.
If it seemed like it was something that they wanted to do.
Right, right.
So what this suggests is that, our judgments of responsibility
Yeah.
might be tied to something beyond just the availability of alternative possibilities.
Right. So kind of like, do they identify with it, I guess? Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. So,
It's
so
really cool,
it
though.
seems like our kind of internal alignment with an action
Right.
can actually play a role in how we view responsibility,
Either way, yeah.
given determinism.
Yeah. And then Namias and colleagues did this other set of studies
Right.
where they described deterministic scenarios.
Right.
And what they found is that people still attributed blame
Okay.
for these morally wrong actions.
Okay.
And so again, this seemed to suggest that people have kind of compatibilist intuitions.
Got it. So it seems like the kind of the results so far maybe are suggesting that,
Yeah.
like, everyday folks are more compatibilist
Yeah.
in their thinking.
That's what it seems to be suggesting, yeah.
Okay.
But then Nichols and Knobe offered this alternative interpretation of the results.
Oh. Oh.
They said that when we read about these harmful actions,
Yeah.
we tend to have an emotional response.
Yeah.
And that might be what's leading us to attribute responsibility.
Okay.
Even if we intellectually believe that the action was determined.
Right. Right.
So to test this, they use these more abstract scenarios
Okay.
where they describe this deterministic universe,
Okay.
and then they contrasted those with concrete scenarios
Yeah.
where there's this moral transgression.
Right.
What they found is that people were less likely to attribute responsibility in the abstract case.
Okay.
And so this led them to say that, maybe our underlying intuition is more incompatibilist,
Right.
but it gets overridden by emotion
Got it.
in these more vivid cases.
Okay. Okay. So our kind of like gut feelings about responsibility then in these situations, are they just like emotional reactions
It could be, yeah.
as opposed to like reasoned judgments?
Yeah, could be. That's a really strong claim, though,
Yeah.
and it's been really heavily debated.
Okay.
Subsequent research hasn't always found
Yeah.
that messing with the emotional content of the scenario
Okay.
really changes the responsibility judgments.
Right. Right.
It seems like, how abstract versus concrete it is
Yeah.
might be the more important thing.
Okay.
And Murray and Namias
Yeah.
made this other interesting point.
Okay.
They said that people might just be interpreting these deterministic descriptions
Yeah.
as implying that the agent's mental states are somehow being bypassed.
Oh, God.
Like the person isn't really thinking or wanting the things they do.
Right. Right.
They argued that when people understand that the agent's thoughts and desires are still part of the causal story,
Okay.
even in a deterministic world,
Yeah.
they're more likely to say that the agent is responsible.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
a lot of back and forth about this.
Yeah, it seems like this debate is far from settled about, free will and responsibility. And it's not just a matter of like,
Right, yeah.
taking a poll of people and
Mhm.
seeing what they think.
It's a lot more subtle than that.
Yeah. So what about arguments for incompatibilism
Right.
that don't actually rely on these folk intuitions?
Right.
Like what about like manipulation arguments, for instance?
Yeah, so manipulation arguments are these arguments that try to show
Yeah.
that if an agent's actions are clearly the result of manipulation,
Right.
then they're not responsible.
Right.
Pereboom has this really famous one called the four-case argument.
Okay.
The basic idea is that, if you're manipulated,
Yeah.
you're not responsible.
Yeah.
And there's really no difference
Oh, yeah.
between that and just being part of this big deterministic causal chain.
Right.
That's the basic idea.
Okay.
Now, empirical research has actually looked at this.
Oh, okay.
They've looked at how people judge these manipulated agents.
Yeah.
And the findings, again, are really interesting.
Okay.
Rapata has this research that suggests that when people see a manipulated agent as not free,
Okay.
it's less about this lack of ultimate control,
Okay.
and it's more about the fact that their psychological capacities are being undermined.
Oh.
So it's like the manipulator is messing with their ability to think clearly
Right.
and to choose in a way that reflects what they really want.
Right.
And this actually lends some support to compatibilist ideas
Right.
that focus on the agent's internal capacities.
Okay.
Phillips and Shaw found that whether there's an intentional manipulator there
Okay.
actually makes a big difference.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So if someone is being manipulated by another agent,
Yeah.
they're seen as less responsible
Yeah.
than if they're just subject to these situational forces.
Okay, that is really interesting. So it seems like our kind of like intuitive understanding of responsibility is very like sensitive to, right?
To the type of like causal story we're being told.
Totally.
Like being deliberately controlled by someone
Yeah.
is seen differently
Are
from
they different? Yeah.
just being, a part of this big causal chain.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
We react to those two things in really different ways.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess, the story so far is that,
Yeah.
Our kind of everyday thinking about morality
Right.
seems to suggest that we might actually be more,
Yeah.
compatibilist than we think.
Yeah, it does seem to point in that direction.
Yeah.
And again, it's a very active area of research.
Right, right. Okay,
Easy.
let's shift gears a bit
Yeah.
and talk about moral character and virtue.
Right.
So this seems like it's like a cornerstone of a lot of ethical theories, right?
Yeah.
But how has psychology complicated our understanding
Wow.
of what character actually is? So this is an area where decades of situationist social psychology research
Okay.
have really, really had a huge impact.
Okay.
These studies have shown over and over
Yeah.
that even small situational factors
Okay.
can have these really big effects on behavior.
Wow.
And they often kind of override what we expect from someone who has a particular character trait.
Okay. Okay. So what are some of the classic studies
Yeah.
that have really driven this character skepticism?
Right, right.
Mm.
So think about the Good Samaritan study,
Okay.
where these seminary students who were in a hurry
Yeah.
were way less likely to help someone who was obviously in need,
Wow.
even if they were on their way to give a talk about helping others.
That's fascinating.
Right. And then there's the Milgram experiment,
Right.
where a lot of people were willing to give these seemingly harmful electric shocks
Yeah.
just because some authority figure told them to.
Right. Right.
And even something as small as finding a dime
Right.
can make you more likely to help a stranger.
Yeah.
So all of these studies are showing us
Yeah.
that our behavior might be more about the situation that we're in
Right.
than these stable internal character traits.
Okay. So then the argument is that, okay, well, if our actions
Yeah.
are so easily kind of influenced by outside forces,
Right.
then the idea that we even have a consistent good character
Yeah.
that reliably predicts our behavior, that
Yeah.
seems questionable.
That's right. Yeah. That's the basic idea behind character skepticism.
Okay.
If behavior is changing so much with the situation,
Right.
then having good character doesn't really tell you that much
Yeah.
about how someone is going to act.
Right.
And some skeptics have even suggested that we should move away from this idea of character altogether in ethical theory.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So this is like a direct challenge to virtue ethics then.
It is.
Which says that, virtuous character is kind of at the heart of the moral life.
It's essential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how have virtue ethicists responded to this situationist challenge?
Yeah. So one response has been to question how good the social psychology findings are.
Right.
Whether they can be replicated.
Right.
But, while there are still debates going on,
Yeah.
the basic finding that the situation really matters
Yeah.
is supported by a lot of research.
Okay.
It's pretty widely accepted.
Right.
And then another strategy has been what we call the dodge, which is just to say that virtue ethics is all about ideals.
Okay.
It's not making claims about psychology. It's
Yeah.
about